Hey everyone, the other day I listened to Jordan Peterson's most recent appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. I think he was there, at least in part, to promote his new book entitled We Who Wrestle with God. I think that's it. But there was a part early on in the episode that caught my attention where Joe brings up Richard Dawkins, and I've noticed Joe seems to have this thing where he really wants Richard Dawkins to try psychedelics. I think he's brought up Dawkins while talking to Peterson in the past as well, and he's brought him up while talking to others like Graham Hancock. And the thrust or gist is always the same. Dawkins is brilliant, but he needs to open his mind. He's too much of a reductionist or scientific materialist. He's never tried psychedelics, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like I'm someone who straddles both worlds. I'm deeply fascinated by and interested in spirituality, and I share Joe's views on psychedelics. I think they can be used to induce powerful and transformative personal experiences. I think they probably have a wide range of therapeutic and medicinal applications that we're just beginning to understand and that we should continue to explore. But at the same time, everyone's different, and I don't think everyone needs to do psychedelics. And Richard Dawkins has always seemed perfectly fine with being a scientific materialist. It's got him this far in life. He's in his 80s now and still has all or most of his marbles, as far as I can tell, even though I might disagree with him on certain political or social issues of late. And at least relatively speaking, he still seems to be thriving and productive. He has his podcast, he still makes public appearances, engages in public talks. And if he doesn't want to take psychedelics, why should he? And I think people assume that because he's a scientific materialist, that Dawkins is some kind of robot who doesn't understand the quote-unquote spiritual side of life. But if you've followed him long enough, you've probably heard him talk about being moved by the beauty of poetry, even biblical poetry like the Psalms, by the beauty of the natural world or the grandeur of the cosmos, by sacred music, including the works of Bach in particular. He just doubts the existence of a god or an afterlife and the supernatural faith claims of man-made religions. And I agree with him or, can relate. I consider myself an agnostic-atheist, don't claim to know but got my doubts. But as I've mentioned on the show before, I hope there is a higher power and an afterlife. I don't like the idea that it's just lights out when we die any more than the next person. But as a matter of personal integrity and out of a desire to know what's actually true, I try not to allow myself to believe something just because I want it to be true or because I find it more palatable than the alternative. But let's finally dive in, and I've broken the segment I harvested from Joe's episode into about 5 little clips, and I'll comment as we go.
And so I've written a lot about that in this new book, We Who Wrestle with God, and that's what I've been lecturing about in 60 different cities, walking through these biblical stories one by one, partly because we have this wrestling match going on in our culture, let's say, between the nihilists and the atheists and the true believers, you might say. And one of the faults of that war is that no one stops to elucidate or delineate exactly what it is that we're arguing about.
And I found that to be kind of rich coming from Jordan Peterson. He's saying that there's this problem where no one stops to elucidate or clarify what exactly it is they're talking about. But he's notoriously evasive if you try to pin him down on God or whether or not he even believes, a God as in a supernatural creator deity actually exists. And he stated, and I'm paraphrasing, a number of times that he doesn't like being asked that question. He takes offense at it. He feels like it's an attempt to corner or trap him. And then I'm sure some of you remember, there was the first time he appeared on Sam Harris's podcast. It was years ago now. And they spent probably over an hour, I think, going around in circles arguing over what the word true or truth means. Sam had a very matter of fact, everyday use of the word truth, factually true, empirically true. And sure, in fairness to Peterson, there are other uses of the word truth, like higher truth, moral truths, that kind of thing. But he had this bizarre definition of truth, which I think he still holds, that truth is utilitarian in a sense. What's true is what is useful. And it was bizarre. And so Sam had trouble just trying to get him to agree on a normal definition of truth. And they pretty much squandered their first discussion on that. It was very bizarre. And I think it may have been during his recent conversation with Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic, where he responded to the idea of being asked the question, do you believe in God? By saying it depends on what you mean by do and you and believe and God. And I was watching another YouTuber respond to the clip. I think his name might have been Magic Skeptic. I just discovered him recently and I've been watching his videos. I believe he's actually a magician who, kind of like Darren Brown, is also a skeptic, hence his name. But yeah, he made a good point. Yeah, God, fair enough. That we have to try to establish a definition of God. I agree there's many different concepts of God, personal versus impersonal, interventionist versus non-interventionist, deistic, pantheistic, nature or the cosmos is God, a metaphorical approach to God, which seems to be where Peterson is coming from what we can tell. I think he once referred to God as the embodiment of our highest ideals or something to that effect. But to say it depends on what you mean by do or you or believe, do we have to have a 2-hour, long philosophical discussion about what basic words like do and you mean before we can discuss God? I remember watching a debate between Rabbi David Wolpe, I think that's how you pronounce it, and either Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris. And the debate was being moderated by this kind of world-weary old rabbi who said, and I'm paraphrasing, before we debate or argue about whether or not God exists, we should first clarify what we mean by God. A bearded old man on a cloud, like in a New Yorker cartoon, or something more figurative or nebulous. And in fairness, that's what Jordan Peterson was kind of saying. There's a problem where people, both the atheists and nihilists, as he puts it, and the true believers, by which maybe he means biblical literalists, are failing to elucidate or clarify what they mean, so you end up talking past each other or jousting at straw men. But that's kind of what he does. He fails to clarify exactly what he means by God, or whether or not he literally believes in a supernatural creator at all. And it might sound like I'm being hard on Jordan Peterson, but to me, two of the most important and profound questions a human being can face or ask themselves, and I think these are also two of the main questions people want their religions to provide answers to, are: is there a God, a literal supernatural creator, some divine entity or intelligence behind it all, and do we actually go somewhere when we die? Is there a literal afterlife? Does the individual self survive bodily death? Brass tacks, no metaphorical pussyfooting. I don't say pussyfooting very often. Is there a God and an afterlife? Those are the two big existential questions that I think most of us want answered. And for all his waxing metaphorical about religion, I think those are two questions that Peterson tends to avoid or evade. And I'm not saying his approach is wrong-headed or useless. Quite the contrary, I think there's a lot of benefit in approaching ancient myths and stories metaphorically. And speaking from personal experience, I think religious and mythic symbolism can be incredibly powerful and transformational, emotionally and psychologically. But I think there is something intellectually dishonest or evasive to me about the way he skirts around the question of whether he literally believes in a God or not. He's calling for clarity, and yet it seems he's the one who's often being unclear, on this particular point at least. But on to the next clip.
So you have people like Dawkins, they parody the traditional conceptions of God, a superstitious being, nothing more than a defense against death anxiety, or the opiate of the masses, the old man in the sky. The conceptualization of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament is unbelievably sophisticated. And to reduce it to that kind of parody is a stunning disservice.
And so I kind of both agree and disagree with Peterson here. I think that both the Old Testament and Christian theology can present a very complex concept of God. Both the Old and New Testaments are essentially libraries, collections of different books written by various authors, etc. And with the Old Testament, different books or passages kind of highlight different concepts or aspects of God. The different names used for God in the Bible can have different connotations. Sometimes God is referred to as if he even has a physical body. How figuratively or literally do you interpret those verses, or any verses for that matter? Then you get into Christian theology and you have concepts like the Logos and the Trinity. So the biblical concept of God or the divine can be seen as being, rather complex. But that being said, I think what Richard Dawkins criticizes and pushes back against is literal belief, superstition, fundamentalism, which I think is a good thing. And don't get me wrong, people should be free to believe whatever they want. People should be free to be religious fundamentalists even, to interpret the Bible literally if they want. The problem arises, in my opinion, when they start trying to force those beliefs on others, infringing on the separation of church and state, etc. And I think it's good to have people like Dawkins out there calling BS on superstition and trying to remind people about the importance of science and factual evidence. And Peterson kind of characterizes Dawkins as someone who doesn't have a sophisticated concept of God and views God as a cartoonish cliche, the idea of an old man up in the sky, or just a buffer against death anxiety. And Dawkins is obviously very intelligent and highly educated. I think he's well aware that there's different ways to approach religion, literally versus figuratively. And he comes from England, where many already embrace a kind of watered-down C of E form of Christianity, the Church of England. And there are many, including higher-ups in the C of E, who take a kind of metaphorical approach. So once again, I'm sure he's aware not everyone views this stuff literally. His problem is with those who do, and the negative effect religious fundamentalism can have on society. And I can speak from personal experience as someone who comes from a working class Catholic family and who grew up surrounded by Christians, that most people, most Christians, at least those I interacted with regularly here in the States, don't have Jordan Peterson's refined, highbrow, Jungian metaphorical approach to religion or God. For them, God is an actual supernatural being, the creator of the universe. Jesus actually walked on water and rose from the dead, and when they die, they get to spend eternity with their loved ones. That's what they believe, or were taught to believe, or try to believe. And as for death anxiety, I totally think one of the main reasons why people value religion is because it tells them there's something more than just death, that there's a life or some eternal reward to come. And I am entirely sympathetic to that. Like I said earlier, I hope there is a higher power and an afterlife out there. I sympathize with anyone, whether they be Christian, Muslim, agnostic, atheist, or whatever. I sympathize with anyone who's wrestling with the idea of their own mortality and the fear of death, wondering what the meaning of it all is. It's something I wrestle with, and it frankly kind of sucks, right? There have been times in my life when the idea of my own death didn't really bother me. I was more upset or frightened. by the idea of losing a loved one than my own dying. And I had a pretty grounded or healthy view of my own mortality. But for a while now, I've been dealing with a certain degree of existential angst. It's similar to an existential crisis I went through in my late teens or early 20s. So if anyone else is going through something like that, I can totally relate. But yeah, I do think one of the main attractions of religion is that it claims to offer an antidote to death anxiety in the form of the promise of an afterlife. Not all religions. Obviously, something like Buddhism is a totally different animal, so to speak. And there's some religions that posit a kind of annihilationism, including certain kinds of Christianity. I believe the Jehovah's Witnesses, who I know not everyone considers Christian, especially other Christians, believe that sinners, or rather the wicked, are simply annihilated rather than condemned to everlasting hellfire. But let's move on to clip 3.
Dawkins is an odd duck. He's an odd duck because I think he knows also that there is some value in psychedelic experiences, but he's scared to have them. And
He won't look through Galileo's telescope.
yeah, but he's had major health crises, right? Didn't he have some sort of a stroke or something like that?
I don't know. I
I
don't
think
know.
he did. I believe he did. I believe he had a major health crisis. It's like, how much time do you have left? Like, what are you going to do? You going to just not try it forever? You're just going to dismiss everything forever?
And I know Dawkins had at least one stroke. I think he may have had several, which is really impressive when you think of how intact his mind is and how eloquent he still is. I'm jumping in through the magic of editing to correct myself. Apologies if it sounds like I'm speaking through a tin can. Apparently it was only one stroke, and it was a hemorrhagic stroke, and supposedly it affected only his coordination and not his speech. Okay. We now rejoin the Week in Doubt already in progress. In fairness to Rogan, I know he had Dawkins on a while back, could have been a couple of years ago now. I watched it and Rogan asked him about psychedelics, but I'm not sure if Dawkins said whether he was afraid to take them or not. I think if he did, it wasn't in the sense that he really wanted to take them but was too nervous to try. And I'm just going by memory, but I think it was probably more the case that yeah, he agreed it seems like you really can have these interesting or meaningful experiences on them, but he didn't think it was worth, trying personally. That, he wasn't curious enough to take the risk. I imagine just going by what I know of him from following him for years, watching many of his conversations and debates, that, from what I know of his personality, that trying psychedelics is probably pretty low on his list of priorities. And, I doubt it's something on his bucket list. And the way Joe says, how much time do you got left? What, are you gonna not try it forever? And as I said, everyone's different. I'm fine with the idea of going to my grave without ever having tried crocheting or playing pickleball or seeing Hamilton. Maybe Dawkins, once again, just doesn't really care enough to bother. Me personally, as I mentioned earlier, I have a very positive and enthusiastic even view of psychedelics. I've had some bad trips, but I've also had some very good ones, usually both during the span of a single trip. For me, and I don't know how much I should say, I don't feel like getting demonetized, but yeah, whatever. For me, with psilocybin, at least, shrooms, usually what would happen is, I'd wonder, am I feeling anything? What's going on? I'd start to feel a little something. It would build, and then eventually I might find myself having a bad trip. And I don't know if it's because I'm naturally neurotic or set in setting, wrong people, wrong place. And then, like I was saying, I would have to struggle my way out of that part of the trip. And when I did, it would kind of open up into like a beatific or sublime, very cathartic experience, almost like being reborn. And I've tried other psychedelics like lysergic acid, And sometimes ecstasy, MDMA, is categorized as a psychedelic. If it is technically, I don't consider it anywhere close to being the same type of substance as what I think of as true psychedelics like psilocybin or lysergic acid. Ecstasy is more like a feel good party drug. And yeah, DMT is definitely on my personal bucket list. I'd like to do it at some point before I die. And when I do, I want to do it responsibly, take it in a safe environment, and with the spirit of kind of exploration and self discovery. And I want to go about it the right way. I've even dreamed of taking a trip to, no pun intended, to say like South America and doing something like ayahuasca, maybe with a group under the supervision of a shaman. I don't know if I'll ever get around to doing that, but that would be pretty cool too. But to get back on track, Rogan also says at the end of that last clip, what are you just going to dismiss everything forever? And I think that feeds into this stereotype that atheists are just completely closed off and dismissive about everything they don't understand or that they're, skeptical of. And maybe some do fit that stereotype. But in my personal experience, most atheists are, like myself, hopefully I'm not being too presumptuous, technically agnostic atheists. They don't claim to know for certain that there's not a God or an afterlife. They're just skeptical or doubtful based on the evidence or lack thereof. And the same for the supernatural in general. But if they're good skeptics, they also try to keep at least something of an open mind and admit, even as unlikely as it might seem to them, that yeah, technically I could be wrong, and try to stay at least somewhat receptive to the possibility of the introduction of new information or evidence that might prove them wrong. And speaking of the possibility of being wrong, I'm one of those non believers who sincerely would love to be proven wrong. I'd love if I woke up to, tomorrow and heard on the news that some kind of psychic or supernatural phenomenon had been scientifically proven, or there was some experiment or a scientific breakthrough that proved that consciousness survives death. I would be the first one doing cartwheels in the street. I don't know how to do a cartwheel, but you get my point. And I'm serious about that. Like I was saying earlier, I'm someone who, really wrestles with the big questions and wrestles with the idea of my own mortality and the meaning of it all. So, yeah, I would be overjoyed if, somehow the existence of the supernatural or the divine or an afterlife were to be proven. But anyway, on to clip 4.
And I feel like people that dismiss things like that, this reductionist perspective, you're essentially saying you have the answers.
And I feel like I already addressed that point to some degree. Just because you believe in following the evidence and in maintaining a healthy skepticism, that doesn't mean you think or claim you know everything.
Mm-hmm. And to dismiss the whole question of God or of whatever you want to call it, higher power, a creator of the universe itself as a conscious entity, whatever it is, to dismiss it just because you're trying to decipher the writings of fairly comparatively unsophisticated people, because we're talking about people from many, many thousands of years ago without access to the information we have today. And then you're also dealing with the fact that many of these stories were of an oral tradition for over 1,000 years before they were ever written down. So to just dismiss that as superstition and silliness without any curiosity about the root of these things, why they resonate with people, and to just say that this is superstitious nonsense that people choose to believe in, and this reductionist perspective of the known reality that we currently exist in. It's a foolish way of interfacing with something, and it's shocking when a obviously brilliant man has a foolish way of interfacing with a very complex situation.
And so here, once again, I think we have Joe kind of unfairly mischaracterizing Dawkins. There were so many things I took issue with in that one little clip that I had to jot them down. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, that Dawkins is dismissing the whole question of God because he takes issue with the beliefs or claims of these man-made religions created by relatively primitive people who pass these stories down orally before, eventually committing them to writing. And Dawkins is foolish for just writing it all off as superstition and having no curiosity about the roots of religion or why we believe and why these stories resonate with us. And he also goes on to describe Dawkins as having a reductionist view of the known reality we exist in, and it's a foolish way of interacting with a very complex situation. I don't think Dawkins necessarily just dismisses the whole question of God because he takes issue with biblical literalism or religious fundamentalism. I think despite being a staunch atheist, Dawkins, like myself, as mentioned before, might technically be an agnostic-atheist. I think I've heard him say before that he thinks, sure, it could be possible that there's a God, anything's possible. He just doesn't see the evidence or proof or remains unconvinced. And I was especially bothered by that assertion that he has no curiosity about the roots of religion or why people believe or these stories resonate with us. I think as an evolutionary biologist, a former professor, I believe he's retired, but I think he's an emeritus fellow at New College, Oxford, I believe. But anyway, to get back on point, as an evolutionary biologist, a scientist, former professor, a science communicator, and a generally intellectually curious person, I think Dawkins is interested in the nature and development of religion and why people believe. I think it may have been in one of the TV series he did, but Dawkins actually tried on the so-called God helmet, which I should do an episode on someday. It's a device that supposedly stimulates the brain in such a way that it induces what feels like a religious experience, in some people at least. I think perhaps not so surprisingly, it didn't have much of an effect on Dawkins, if I remember correctly, which kind of makes you wonder if maybe some people are just naturally wired to be more skeptical or resistant to such experiences. But in fairness to Dawkins, as previously mentioned, he's spoken about having really moving experiences induced by things like art, music, nature, etc. But my point is, contrary to not being curious about these aspects of religion or God belief, he's even investigated that kind of thing for his various TV series and documentaries. And the bit about him being foolish for having a reductionist view of our known reality, he's a scientist. He follows the evidence and calls BS on BS. If you want to learn about the reality we inhabit, following the evidence might be a good way to go about it. One more little clip.
Well, it's especially odd in his case because he's also the formulator of the idea of meme. And
Right.
a religious story is a meme that's been selected by time and crowd. That's a good way of thinking about it. It strikes to the heart of the matter in ways that are sophisticated beyond conscious understanding.
I actually appreciate Jordan Peterson's comments there. Very straightforward, and that is true. Dawkins is actually the one who coined the term meme. Did he first write about it in The Selfish Gene? I'm not sure. I think so. And he says, paraphrasing, drink every time I say paraphrasing, as long as you're not driving. Anyway, that religious stories are memes that are selected by time and crowd and are sophisticated beyond conscious understanding. I think that might be close to verbatim, actually. But that's an interesting explanation in a couple of ways. For one, I think that's probably accurate in a way. Stories that resonate retain popularity and get passed on, and it kind of gives insight into or encapsulates Peterson's approach? Well, it was probably already pretty obvious that he does approach these stories figuratively or metaphorically, and he tries to mine them for the perennial symbolism or messages within. And then, too, I also find it interesting because one thing that's long fascinated me about Jordan Peterson and the dynamic between himself and his audience is that he's credited with leading a number of young male followers to Christianity, even though he takes this very figurative, Jungian, Joseph Campbell-esque, even though I personally prefer Campbell approach to the Bible. And I've always wondered if these people he's inspired to embrace Christianity believe literally and accept the miracle stories and the supernatural faith claims, or if they follow or emulate his more figurative approach. I don't know. It probably varies, I imagine. But I'm gonna end it there. I am tuckered out. Why do I always use figures of speech on the podcast that I don't use in real life? I don't think I've ever said tuckered out. But anyway, yeah, I'm tired, so I'm going to end it there. And as always, thank you everyone for listening. You guys know the drill. You can like the Facebook page. You can follow me on Twitter or X, even though I'm not on there much. You can check out the YouTube channel. Maybe you're doing that now. If you'd like to support the show monetarily, which is always greatly appreciated, you can go to patreon.com/theweekendoubt and support what I do here for as little as 99 cents a month. And I've been pretty good at sticking to my word and releasing a new bonus show every Thursday. So hopefully that's an additional incentive besides just, showing your support monetarily. You can get some bonus material. All right, brothers and sisters, until next time.